A disorderly climate transition with divergent approaches could trigger economic volatility and drive countries further apart. That is just one of many key findings from the 7th edition of the Global Risks Report. It's put together by the World Economic Forum. Today, we're going to look at some of the key highlights with Spiros Fatouros from Marsh, along with Chris Palm, who is Chief Risk Officer here at IRMSA. I'm Jeremy Maggs, and a very warm welcome. Spiros, I want to start with you, and a very warm welcome. As we sit here, the World Economic Forum has released this global risk report that I've already mentioned, having concluded the virtual Davos meeting this year. What can you tell us, top line, about the global risk report, and maybe Marsh McLennan's contribution and involvement in the document itself?
Great afternoon, Jeremy. Yeah, thank you. So Marsh McLennan is one of the key partners with the World Economic Forum in terms of putting this report together. It's now in its 17th edition. So the Global Risk Report is really underpinned by what we call a global perception survey. So a survey done by thousands of individuals around the world that look at the risks and think about the risks in a short-term, medium-term, and longer-term horizon. And then really the WEF, with coordination with Marsh and McLennan and with a few other organizations, really thinks about how all those risks pull together and how they're interconnected to each other, which is the key thing. So, I think the top highlights from a risk perspective, I think this year the big risks are again continuing to be climate risks. I think we're looking at a bigger area, a bigger risk around social divide and social cohesion. Cyber risk remains critical as always, and then really an uneven economic recovery, sort of post the pandemic. Those are the key risks, Jeremy.
And I was going to say all of this, of course, against the overhang of the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you were to pick out, Spiros, a couple of those key risks that you're concerned about from a global perspective, what would be on your list, having already named some of the highlights? What's keeping you up at night?
I think, Jeremy, the biggest risk we face at the moment, I think, as humanity, is really extreme weather. I mean, if you really think about the challenges we face, whether you look at the short-term, medium-term, or longer-term, weather and weather-related risks remain the top 5 from both a frequency and a severity perspective. And again, you take the backdrop of the pandemic, you take the backdrop around some of the challenges we've had with global multinational or multilateral relationships, and the impact of those at a time when the world really needs to be pulling together to solve like a key issue for humanity. I think that's what really worries me. You look at the recent COP26 meeting that was held, we're still a way off from meeting the target of dropping temperatures by 1.5 degrees. And that becomes a fundamental issue. And I think that's an issue for society as a whole. And then to my point earlier around the interconnectedness, if you think about climate change and the risks around weather, you overlay the impact of the pandemic on sort of social divide and social cohesion, and you talk about different levels of economic recovery and how that plays in terms of economies as they're trying to come out of the pandemic. How do they weigh up, green energy versus dirty energy in terms of the economic recovery? So you see how everything really comes together. But for me, the biggest issue, I think, is extreme weather, Jeremy.
How do governments and the private sector balance their approach going forward, whether it be about climate change or the myriad other risks that are in this report and also the local IRMSA report, which we'll get to in just a moment? It's critical that there is a level of synergy, isn't there?
Oh, correct, Jeremy. And unfortunately, the report doesn't look to address all the solutions. The report really highlights, I think, the risks. Creates the format, and at least we have consensus then around what some of the key challenges are. I mean, fundamentally, the report will say it countless times, you have to have the right stakeholders engaging in a proactive and a constructive manner. And again, you need to think about, if you talk about economic sustainability and you talk about climate change, different countries will have to decarbonize at different levels, and how do you engage and get that done to still meet the long-term needs of the planet from an environmental perspective, but obviously the short-term and medium-term challenges that many economies are facing as they're coming out of the pandemic. So, unfortunately, I don't have any of the easy answers, but I think the theme through the report is, multi-level stakeholder engagement, focusing on the key risk issues and driving the change. And hopefully, as you mentioned, the virtual Davos conference, hopefully a lot of those conversations have been picked up and have been driven by government and senior leaders.
Spiros, in a report that you've just authored, you talk about a better national level preparedness when it comes to investment, when it comes to planning, when it comes to execution. What it says to me is that we need to change the way in which we're thinking. How do organizations need to recalibrate that approach to business, I wonder?
Yeah, I think, Jeremy, the key issue from the last 2 years is really post the pandemic. It's an elevation and much more critical thinking around resilience of our organizations. It's been way more proactive in terms of thinking about these black swan events and thinking about how we fundamentally deal with this. So, resilience is front and center. And interestingly enough, if you look at the risks in the short term to medium term, environmental is there, but other risks come up such as cyber and social cohesion and economic recovery. But in the longer term, those risks fall away. So we've got to ask ourselves the question, is that because we're seeing deliberate measures to influence sort of the risk of cyber in the long term? Or is that potentially a blind spot that many organizations have when you think about cyber 10 years from now? So the big issue is resiliency, making that a key priority and critically bringing to the board level the issues around risk management, preparedness, and scenario planning. And that's the only way organizations are going to get it right.
Spiros, before I bring Christopher Palm in, just a quick one. How would you define resilience in that respect? What do organizations need to do in order to become more resilient, I wonder?
Again, I think they need to look at their existing risk management plans in place. They need to look at their existing methodology and culture around resiliency and review those with a fresh approach off the back of the pandemic and really challenge the status quo and challenge where they're spending the right amount of money. I think what the pandemic has highlighted to us is that black events do happen, but I think as organizations and as humanity, we're pretty resilient to change. So, review what you have, embrace the change as you think forward to how you can restructure your organization to better position yourself to handle these challenges and create more resilient businesses.
Spiros, I'll get back to you in just a moment with some closing thoughts, but let me bring Christopher Palm in now from IRMSA. Chris, let's bring it local if we can. What can we expect from the 2022 risk report that comes out very shortly, just in terms of the key risks? But maybe start off with climate. IRMSA makes the point that slow and or inadequate adaptation or response to current and future climate change could have a huge impact. Let's position our conversation there to start with.
So good afternoon, Jeremy. Good afternoon, Spiros. Jeremy, if we put the World Economic Forum risks into context in a South African perspective, we consider the National Development Plan objectives. We'd always look at those objectives. And of course, climate change features heavily on, and I would assume, most national, continental, and the global risk radars. But from a South African perspective, although we have it and we are considering extreme weather, climate change, and all its consequences and the likelihoods that are surrounding that sort of risk, when you consider the socio-economic risk profile, maybe even the social political risk profile of South Africa, it does feature on our risk profile for the country, but it's by no means the most important risks that we are currently dealing with, both from a threat perspective as well as from the opportunities that we're looking to leverage.
In fact, what is of deep concern to the Institute of Risk Management of South Africa is leadership and also education and skills. These aren't new, of course, but they are front and center when it comes to debating managing risk in 2022.
Absolutely. We've been talking about ethical and visionary leadership for the last 3 maybe even 4 years in the South Africa risk profile. And that coupled with one of the risks that we've been highlighting and still dealing with, and that is the deeply entrenched fraud and corruption. So when one considers all the support that we get, and back to the climate change question that you asked, we are getting green funding, we are getting international loans. The problem that we sit though is we still haven't made enough progress in addressing systemic fraud and corruption. So all of the support, all of the benefits that we get, all of the goodwill internationally are still subjected to a systemic fraud and corrupt culture in South Africa. If one considers COVID-19 and what we've learned from the personal protective equipment, commercial processes and the spending of money there, this is something that we will keep on talking about. And we expect that from ethical and visionary leadership, where we have the right people in the positions, the skilled people in the positions to address this, that's when we will make progress moving forward. Culminating, or at least you will be able to see the outcome in microeconomic improvements with macroeconomic support.
So when it comes to leadership, Chris Palm, how do organizations need to have the debate internally?
Well, I think you asked the question to Spiros earlier on. What is the relationship between the public and the private sector in South Africa? And I think the debate is one of creating partnerships between the public and the private sector and continuous collaboration, Jeremy. We have to understand that the skills are not adequately abound for us to be able to make the change, and that we need to get into those partnerships, cross-pollinate skills, leadership, the improvement of our ethical landscape through collaboration.
Spiros, let me bring you back into the conversation very briefly. Surely leadership and skills deficiency is not just a South African problem. Is this something that is also occupying risk managers' minds globally, do you think?
I think it is an issue. I think we have a much more acute challenge in South Africa, Jeremy. If you think about the legacy that we need to deal with from an education perspective, we look at some of our challenges. I mean, if we look at our education and you compare it to some of the Asian tigers, you compare it to the Europeans and to the US, yeah, I think we come off a different footing, which has some challenges. But fundamentally, I think the ability of leaders to think outside the box, to look at challenges and reframe them differently than the past, and maybe use a different muscle that they've used previously. I think that is a global challenge that, I think we have to embrace. If you think about the fourth industrial revolution, you think about the pace of change, you think about technology, irrespective of your education, irrespective of your qualification, irrespective, I think, of your history and your perspective, I think being adapt to change is something that all leaders need to embrace. And I think for a lot of leaders, that is a stretch. And it's something I think we all collectively need to work on to, deal with some of the challenges that you've highlighted. And as Christopher said, some of the solutions to create those unique partnerships between public and private sector to solve some of the really systemic challenges we have in the global risk stage at this moment.
At least we're talking about it and getting to grips with it. Christopher Palm, obviously, and I'm not going to go through every single risk that will be included in IRMSA's 2022 risk report. We'll wait for the launch in that respect. But I do want to focus on an important issue that you raised, and this will draw us to the end of our conversation. You talk about economically inactive parts of the population growing, and I quote, beyond society's ability to fund them. How close from a risk perspective are we to that point, and how big a worry is it?
I think we are seriously concerned about this, Jeremy. Again, this is where we are looking at all the different institutions that make up our government and how the government then supports the citizens of our country. And we are at a point now where paying to get a job is part of our culture. I was talking about the fraud and corruption side of things. Services rendered by the public institutions. For you to be able to get your pension payout comes at a cost. And the services, the quality of services rendered from a municipality level all the way through to governmental departments are at risk here. And so we're not just looking at a bad quality service, we're looking at a failed state as an outcome of this risk if not managed properly. And of course, again, I would like to add to that is that we need to look wider. Spiros spoke about changing the paradigm, thinking about different ways or different ways to articulate these challenges that we face. And we need to look at the private sector to support us here, to make sure that we can roll out the right skills, to roll out the right competencies in these fundamental positions within the service delivery, within the ambit of running out of capacity to service the inactive part. And I'm talking about a 50% unemployment rate, maybe not the formal calculation, but certainly very close to that if one considers unemployment currently in South Africa. And how are we going to respond to this to try and turn this percentage into an active participant in the economy of South Africa?
So much to talk about, and a lot more of that is obviously going to be fleshed out in the 2022 IRMSA Risk Report, which is out at the end of February. Christopher and to Spiros, thank you very much for the insight and the conversation today.